Hello, everybody. This is Matthew from MiniWarGaming.com with guest star Kraig from DC. It almost sounds like DC Comics or something. People are going to think that, especially because you're wearing a Batman.
He's DC, isn't he? He is DC.
I actually couldn't answer that question.
I think he is DC. I think the other one's Marvel, and he's not Marvel. I think he is DC.
Yeah, I actually don't know. Dave would know the answer to that, but he's not here today. And this is another episode of Rules Debates, or Rule Debates. Rule Debate, because we're only discussing one rule. Right. Actually, we're going to be discussing a few rules, Skyfire, Flyers. And today, the question is, can the Necron Death Ray hit Flyers? And there's actually a couple other questions in there, too. If it does it also hit the ground units, etc., etc.? We'll get into that. This is actually hotly debated. And one thing I just want to comment before we get into this is if you're in the middle of an argument or debate on a forum, and there's a bunch of people who clearly think it's one way, and there's a bunch of people who clearly think it's another, then respect that. Because if it's people thinking clearly it's one way, and there's a lot of them, and there's not like an obvious consensus and everybody's just jumping on the one guy who's trying to do something wrong with the rules, then most likely there's something ambiguous in the rules. And we've already talked about this in the last video, that Games Workshop is not the best at making things very, very crystal clear. And then on top of that, you get codexes written in different editions, and then FAQ'd, and which doesn't always clear it up. So the question is, very simply, can Death Rays hit Flyers? Yes or no?
I say they can.
Okay, and then we'll discuss why.
All right.
So before we go any further, let's read the ruling for a Death Ray, how it works. And the Death Ray is a very interesting weapon because it doesn't work like other shooting weapons. The only thing similar between it and other shooting weapons is it has a strength and an AP, and it's fired in the shooting phase. That's about it. Everything else about it is different, which is why it causes problems. So I'm going to read it right here. To fire the Death Ray, nominate a point on the battlefield, anywhere within the weapon's range, then nominate a second point within 3d6 inches of the first. Then draw a straight line between the 2 points. Every unit, friendly or enemy, underneath the line suffers a number of hits equal to the number of models in the unit underneath the line. And this has been clarified to mean like if you put a line over, and it's a unit of 30 boys and the line passes over 5 of them, it's saying that unit is hit by a number of hits equal to the number of guys underneath the line. So it's hit by 5 hits.
Basically it's whoever the line touches is hit.
Yeah, and it's to clarify that for wound allocation, you can't snipe out guys. So they're hit 5 times because 5 guys were covered, but you still go with your regular wound allocation. Right. Because people were arguing that, a couple of dumb things. But we're not going to go into that. That's not the question here. If the vehicle's other weaponry, okay, that doesn't matter. Yeah, so that's the ruling. Now in the FAQ, it adds one thing. It says this line is 1 millimeter thick. And that's important, actually, because theoretically a line has no width, has no thickness. And so it's hard to tell if something would be under the line because it'd have to be obviously under the line. But it says it's 1 millimeter thick, just for the sake of argument. So that's the ruling. Now, before we go any further, I want to talk about one argument that people have about this. They say that you put the point on the battlefield. Now, what would you define as the battlefield?
You just got to look at it. The battlefield is the field where the battle is taking place, which means in the air, on the ground, and some creatures even go under the ground and come back up. The battlefield is everything you can see. In my opinion, that's the battlefield. I
think the only thing in the game that's not part of the battlefield would be reserves. Because it basically says that if there's nothing on the battlefield or on the... I'm not sure if it uses the word table or battlefield in the book. If there's nothing on it by the end of a turn, then you lose, right?
Right.
So obviously reserves aren't part of the battlefield.
Right, because I think that strengthens the point. They're not on the battlefield. They're off on the side. The battlefield is everything you can see.
So I just wanted to squash that first argument. Some people said, well, a flyer is up here. You have to put the line on the table because it says on the battlefield. Therefore, the flyer can't be hurt. Now, if you think about that for a second, that means that nothing could be hit by it.
Right.
Because if you put the line on the actual table, then any models will be over top of that line.
Right.
And so, therefore, the Death Ray can hit nothing. So I want to take that argument and toss it out the window right away.
Right. Because the rule would have said on the table. It doesn't say on the table. It says on the battlefield.
Now, the only problem with that is that we're assuming Games Workshop is using consistent words. Yeah, that's a good reaction to that comment. And that's the problem. And this is not an insult. This is just an observation. They don't use consistent wording in their rules. Not always.
Right.
Not consistently. And therefore, there's these arguments. Well, what is a battlefield? Is it the table or is it the three-dimensional space? Because if you say it's a table, then fast skimmers, jet bikes, jump infantry because they land on the table. But anything that stays above the table all the time, flyers, they're not part of the battlefield. Therefore, if they're on the field but you don't have anything touching the ground, then you lose by the end of the turn. Like, obviously, that is not the intent. I think everybody, except those who just like to troll, will agree with that. So there's that argument right there. So here's the problem. So it's pretty, I think it's pretty clear. It's been clarified before flyers came in. You draw the line, everything underneath the line takes a hit, friendly, enemy, locked in assault, not locked in assault, because it doesn't target anybody. So it doesn't follow the normal rules for having to have a target. It just says that the first point has to be in line of sight, or it has to be within the weapon's range. Now, whether the argument is this weapon fixed forward or does it swivel? Let's just assume that it's fixed forward, but it doesn't really matter, because its range is 12 inches, which from a flyer you measure 45 degrees down, so you've got this 12-inch line right there. So,
even to support what you just said, it says every unit, friendly or enemy. So every unit underneath the line suffers the number of hits.
So now here's the arguments. And I can see it going both ways, and we'll talk about them. And then we will tell what our house rule is going to be. And then, of course, you can leave a comment below what you think. But try to watch the whole video before you leave a comment, just so you can hear all the different arguments. So the first thing we're going to look up is a flyer special rule. So under flyers, they have hard to hit. So zooming flyers, which basically if it's not in hover mode, we're just going to assume the flyer is in flying mode, are incredibly difficult target for troops without suitable calibrated weapons and skills. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Shots, here's a good example of wording. Shots resolved at a zooming flyer can only be resolved as snapshots. Okay, so that's the first problem with our wording. Resolved. What is resolved? What is a shot that's resolved?
Is that rolling dice, or is that just drawing lines?
Yeah, is it I've already rolled to hit, so now I'm resolving that hit? Or is resolving it rolling to hit? Or is resolving it all of that? And you might think, well, that's a dumb question. Resolving is just you're hitting it. But the problem with this is that part of resolving a hit is choosing a target. So I target your flyer.
Right.
And then I fire.
And then you roll to hit.
Right.
And in this case, you don't do that. You draw a line, and it auto-hits everything underneath the line.
Exactly. And now here, somebody might say, well, let's continue this for a second. We'll get to another point. Shots resolved at a zooming flyer can only be resolved as snapshots. Template, blast, and large blast weapons cannot hit flyers in zoom mode. I had heard one argument that the Death Ray is a template weapon. Because it's a millimeter thick and it's a line, it's a template. What do you think of that?
Negative, wrong. Templates are the templates that Games Workshop sells.
Yeah.
You got a large template, you got a small template, you got a flamer template.
In fact, usually when it says template, it's referring to the flamer template,
right,
where it even says blast, large blast, and template weapons.
Right.
So the fact that they use template for the flamer, that's kind of confusing. I like Privateer Press's way they call a spray template, or spray. But that's okay, because we know they're consistent with that. Whenever they say template, they actually mean the flame template.
Teardrop, yes.
Exactly, because they always specify if it's hit by a template blast. They even go as far as saying blast and large blast. Right. So that's actually good. That's very good wording. So we'll take that argument that, well, it's a 1 millimeter wide line, therefore it's a template, therefore it can't hit flyers. Well, I think that's out the window. Do you agree?
Completely.
Okay, so we've knocked down those two arguments. So it says it can only be resolved as snapshots. So let's take the first thing where a flyer basically can choose, right here, special rules. Flyers can choose whether or not to use the Skyfire special rule at the start of each shooting phase. So basically what that means, Skyfire means that when you're targeting
another
flyer, you don't have to do a snapshot. So, but you still can't hit it with a blast, large blast, or template, because it says that they'll never be able to hit by that, not just because of snapshots. So let's say that it doesn't choose Skyfire, so that it's just shooting at guys on the ground. Mm-hmm. So let's look at that one first. So now you have Skyfire open, or sorry, snapshots open. So then read the part that's bolded right there.
If a model is forced to make a snapshots rather than shooting normally, then its ballistic skill is counted as being 1 for the purpose of those shots.
Okay, so that's the first part. That's pretty clear. Now there's another part in here. So start with the it's important to note.
It's important to note that any shooting attack that does not use a ballistic skill, such as a Necron Monolith's Portal of Exile, cannot be fired as a snapshot.
Now, here's the interesting part. What do you notice about the word fired?
You have to shoot it.
No. What is it? What do you notice on the page about the word fired?
You got me what?
It's in quotes.
Okay.
It cannot be fired as a snapshot. What the heck does that? Why did they put quotes around it? Like, why did they do that? Why did they put quotes around it? Okay, so the question is, are you firing the Death Ray as a snapshot? Now, if let's say the flyer, the Necron flyer, gets hit and takes a crew stun. I think crew stun forces you to only take snapshots, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I think it's clear that he would not be able to fire the Death Ray. Do you agree?
Yes.
Because it's a weapon that doesn't use a ballistic skill.
Correct.
Right. Okay, so that's clear. So, yeah, you're reading it over and over again, right?
Because the ambiguity, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so the question is, okay, let's say he's not stunned, he's in perfect health, or whatever you call Necrons, and he draws this line, okay, so he doesn't target anything.
All right.
So it says right here, shots resolved at a zooming flyer can only be resolved as snapshots. So I put a point in the ground, or in the battlefield, sorry,
right.
And I put another point 3d6 inches away. Let's say it crosses over 5 orcs on the ground, and then it also crosses over an orc bomber. Okay, which it definitely would, where we don't have to argue the fact that that line crosses over the bomber because it's part of the battlefield. So it doesn't have Skyfire on, so we definitely hit the five out of the unit of orcs there. They take 5 hits. The question is, does the flyer get hit? Well, I would say yes, it gets hit because the rule is very clear in the Necron book. It says all enemy or friendly models underneath are hit with blah, 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 but they are hit automatically. But then it says shots resolved at a zooming flyer can only be resolved as snapshots. So we get what we call in programming an infinite loop. Because I hit your flyer.
Right.
And therefore I'm resolving the shot. But the shot can only be resolved as a snapshot, which a Death Ray can't be fired as. But the Death Ray did not target the flyer. What are your thoughts on that?
Now, cinematically thinking, which I know you're not supposed to apply real-life rules to a Warhammer, but would you envision that as a line on the ground and anything above that line takes the hit? Or would it be an actual fan coming out from the beam itself? Well,
see, there's lots of different arguments because when you're playing, you move, and then you stop your guy, and then you shoot. But really, in reality, they're never stopping. In fact, that's what they're trying to simulate, right? So I kind of envision the Death Ray as it moves. It's like doing strafing runs. And so theoretically, it could fly over a flyer, and as it's firing straight down and leaves this line of death, or it swivels around, whatever. You're going to get this kind of a fan effect, but it can go in almost any direction.
Right.
So, I don't know.
Because I've seen in DC, local gaming shops, them actually taking the Games Workshop laser and putting it by the Death Ray, and then they draw on the fan, and whatever it hits, based on that line on the ground, that's what takes the hits.
See, and I would disagree with that. That's cool. I think that's neat. But the rule doesn't say anything about doing that. It just says, draw your line, everything underneath the line is a straight down to the battlefield. Or, sorry, to the table. It's through the battlefield to the table. So that's the problem. And I actually have a problem with that. I'm not sure, actually, what's supposed to happen there. Our house rule is that since it's being resolved against a flyer as a snapshot, and snapshots, if your weapon does not use a ballistic skill, cannot... See, the problem is it can't be fired. See, this is where that whole quotation's around the word fired. Right. It was already fired. It can't be fired as a snapshot, but can it damage as a snapshot? And it might sound ridiculous, especially to some people who are newcomers to the game. It might sound even ridiculous that we're having this conversation, but it's important. It's important for tournaments. It's important for our battle reports to make sure we're doing the rule right.
Especially with the power of this weapon. I mean, it's strength 10.
AP 1.
Right. So
auto-hitting.
It annihilates what it hits pretty much.
And flyers don't stand a chance against it because they're all armor 11. If you're lucky, they're armor 12. So that's my problem here. So then you switch it a bit here. You say, okay, what if the flyer chose to have Skyfire? All right. Now the Tesla destructor or the Tesla cannon that it has, no problem.
Right.
When it's not declared Skyfire, it has to fire at units on the ground.
Right. It's a weapons profile.
Or no, sorry, it could fire at the flyer, but then it'd be doing the snapshots.
Right.
And yeah, that one's straightforward, and it has to fire at something that hits.
Right. It has to fire at something
that the Death Ray hits.
So it impacts that weapon too, because depending on what you're now saying are valid targets for that line, that's the only options that weapon can shoot at now.
Exactly. Although I'm not arguing the fact that the flyers are hit by the death ray. I'm arguing the fact of whether that hit is then resolved properly. Because the snapshot says you cannot fire a weapon that does not use a ballistic skill as a snapshot, but you're not. And then the flyer part says the shots resolved are resolved as snapshots. I would think if I were to make a guess, my guess is that the wording here, shots resolved as a zooming flyer, should have actually been written. Any shooting attacks targeting a zooming flyer, should be resolved as snapshots. And then it becomes clear, not for the death ray, but for a lot of other things, with the order of operations there. But the death ray doesn't target. That's our big conundrum here, is the death ray doesn't target. It can hit your own units. It can hit guys locked in combat. It can do all the things that normal shooting can't do. So let's say you take Skyfire. You say, okay, this round is Skyfire. So then you draw that line again. The Tesla cannon, no problem. You know if you're going to fire at
straightforward.
Yeah, very straightforward. But this line, all of a sudden, you're drawing that same line. Now does it hit the ground units? But just says anything underneath.
Right.
And it says here with Skyfire that it won't be shot as a snapshot, so it seems pretty clear that you hit a flyer. So this is just confusing. It's actually confusing. So what do you think? If you take Skyfire, does it become oh yeah, the death ray definitely hits flyers?
I think so. Because you draw the line, and it just says draw a line in the battlefield. And that's part of the debate. What is the battlefield? I believe that the flyers are in the battlefield. So you draw a line between two flyers in the battlefield, you hit both of them.
What about the guys on the ground?
It says anyone, what is above the line it says?
Anyone below the line.
Anyone below the line.
Is hit.
Well, they're below the line. If you look over the line and you look down, they're below the line.
But then the problem with that is if you're using the Skyfire special rule, you can only fire snapshots at things at the ground.
Okay, but it's still...
But snapshot says you can't fire it as a snapshot. Right. But you're not firing it as a snapshot. You're simply drawing a line. I think that's our big problem here.
I think we'll leave it up to them to decide.
Well, like I said, our house rule is this. It's pretty straightforward. The line can hit flyers, but it only damages what you choose. Like you say Skyfire, so the line will only hit flyers. So basically the way I think of it cinematically is now he's pointing that death ray straight up in the air going rup, and so there's nobody underneath.
And he didn't fly over him and go rup.
I know. Well, and on top of that, I could say, well, then everything in this horizontal
right
will hit all the flyers in front of me.
The 18-inch line is drawn on the back wall of the gaming room.
Yeah. And underneath is all... It depends on which way your flyers turn.
Exactly.
So if I model my flyer this way,
right,
then underneath would actually be horizontal.
And that's how ridiculous some of these rules interpretations get, because they're just so ambiguous how they write them.
Yeah, exactly. So house rule: if you declare Skyfire as you're shooting, you only hit flyers with your death ray. If you don't declare Skyfire, you only hit ground units. Do you agree? Feel free to leave a comment saying you don't if you don't, but tell the reasons why, and give really good arguments if you can. And if you can't, just you can troll and let other people thumb you down. Thumb up all the arguments that you think are good. Thumb down all the arguments you don't think are good. And stay tuned for even more. And our next video, what are we going to cover in the next one? What did we say we were going to talk about?
How about the Necron...
the death marks?
Death marks, yes.
Okay, we're going to be covering another Necron thing. Well, we'll move on to another army after this. But the next question is, when death marks do their ethereal interception, I think is what it's called,
yes, do
they get to shoot in the enemy shooting phase? Stay tuned for the next video. This is Matthew from MiniWarGaming and Kraig from DC. Not DC Comics. Please don't sue us. Happy wargaming.